You're listening to this on a frequency that isn't supposed to exist. I don't know who you are, or if you're even there, but tonight, the cold in this basement is deep enough to settle in your marrow. If you're looking for a bedtime story, you found the wrong one. If you're looking for the truth about the quiet hours of the morning, then stay. My name is Arthur Phillips. They didn't put my name on the wall at Stateville Prison. They just gave me a badge, a number, and a key. I am, or at least I was, the man tasked with the state's darkest work. I am the executioner. Don't look for morality here. Morality doesn't walk through the steel doors of the death house. Only duty does. I'm speaking into this receiver because the silence in my head has become a roar, and I need to put these memories somewhere else. I need to get them out before they finish eating what's left of me. It was October, 1944. The air in Illinois was already biting, the kind of winter that doesn't just chill you, it claims you. That was the year they brought Elias Thorne to the Sea Wing. I remember the morning they processed him. The wardens usually look at a man with indifference, but when Elias walked in, the air changed. It went stale, like breath held too long. He wasn't a large man. He didn't have the broad shoulders of a fighter or the jagged scars of a lifelong criminal. He was thin, pale, and possessed a stillness that was unnatural. He didn't look at the guards. He didn't look at the walls. He looked through us. I was the one who had to strip him. I checked his pockets, his collar, the seams of his jacket. When I reached for his hands to apply the cuffs, he stopped me. Not with force, but with a look. His eyes were the color of stagnant water, flat and heavy. "You're the one, aren't you?" he whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "The one who balances the scales." I didn't answer. I just cuffed him and walked him to his cell. But I felt it, the cold. It wasn't the weather. It was him. He wasn't afraid of the cage. He was observing the architecture of his own end. The first few nights, I couldn't sleep. The prison is never truly quiet, it's a living thing that groans and shifts, but Elias's cell was a vacuum. I'd walk the perimeter during my night watch, my boots echoing on the flagstone, and every time I passed his door, I knew he was awake. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't praying. He was just standing in the corner, facing the wall, watching his own reflection in the shadows. I started to notice things. The other inmates would scream at night, clawing at their bars, but when they walked past Elias's cell on the way to the mess hall, they went silent. They stepped around his door as if it were a grave. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation. A man in solitary does strange things to his mind. But I was the one holding the keys. I was the one who knew the layout of the gallows room. I was the one who knew the distance between the floorboards and the concrete pit below. One night, the heater in the Sea Wing failed. The temperature plummeted, and the frost began to bloom on the inside of the cell windows like jagged glass flowers. I had to go in with a maintenance crew to check the pipes. As I knelt down near his bed, I saw them. Scratched into the floorboards under his cot weren't names or dates. It was a diagram. A perfect, precise drawing of the mechanism of the gallows. He had the lever, the trapdoor, and the exact weight distribution of a man's neck mapped out. He knew the machine better than I did. He didn't speak while we worked. He just stood by the door, watching my hands. When I stood up, my pulse was hammering against my throat. I tried to walk away, to get back to the warmth of the guard room, but he spoke again. "You think you're in control, Arthur," he said, not even turning to look at me. "But you're just the apprentice. You haven't seen the depth of the hole yet. You haven't felt the weight of someone who refuses to let go. I didn't tell the warden. I didn't tell anyone. I went back to my room, poured a glass of cheap, burning whiskey, and stared at the ceiling. I told myself it was just a psychopath playing games. But that night, I didn't dream. I just fell into a void. And in that void, I could hear the sound of rope tightening, a slow, agonizing creak of dry fiber. It was the sound of a man waiting for his invitation to hell. The winter was only just beginning, and Elias Thorne was already counting the days until I would be the one to open the door for him. And deep down, in the part of me I thought was dead, I knew. He wasn't waiting for the state to kill him. He was waiting for me to join him in the pit. The nights grew longer, and the silence in the C-wing started to feel like a physical pressure, something that pushed against your chest whenever you walked down the corridor. My routine had become a series of ghost movements. I'd check the locks, walk the perimeter, and try not to look into cell 402. But I always did. Elias Thorne was always there. He didn't sleep, at least not in a way that involved closing his eyes and drifting off. He would sit on the edge of his cot, perfectly motionless, his hands resting on his knees. It was as if he were waiting for a train that only he could hear approaching. I started to notice details that made my skin crawl. He had a way of timing his breathing to mine. If I stopped to listen at his door, he'd slow his breath. If I hurried past, he'd speed his up, just enough for me to hear it as a soft, rhythmic rasp. He was studying me. He was mapping my habits, my hesitations, the exact second my hand trembled before turning the heavy iron key in the lock. It was mid-November when the warden finally gave the order. The paperwork for Thorne's execution had come through. It was official. He had 30 days. I should have felt a sense of completion. My job is to execute the law, not the man. But that night, as I did my rounds, I didn't feel like an official of the state. I felt like a servant in a house that didn't belong to me. When I reached his door, I stopped. I didn't look through the small viewing slit. I just stared at the cold, painted steel. "Open the door, Arthur," Elias said. His voice didn't come from the corner of the cell. It came from right behind the door, as if he were standing inches away, waiting for me to acknowledge his presence. I didn't reach for the key. I gripped the cold bars of the neighboring cell instead. "You shouldn't be awake," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to sound like a guard and not a man who was losing his grip on reality. He laughed then. It wasn't a malicious sound. It was the sound of someone watching a child try to solve a puzzle that had no solution. "You're afraid of the rope," he whispered. "You've been around it for years, you've handled it, you've tested it, but you don't understand it. It's not a tool for killing. It's a tool for measuring." "Measuring what?" I asked, cursing myself the second the words left my lips. "Measuring how much of a man remains when he realizes he's already dead," he replied. "Come in here. I want to show you something." I didn't go in. I couldn't. I walked away, my boots hitting the stone floor with a frantic, uneven rhythm. I went straight to the gallows room. I needed to see the machine. I needed to see that it was just wood, steel, and gravity. I needed to see that it was inanimate. I turned the lights on, the harsh, yellow glare revealing the empty pit. The trapdoor looked harmless, just a slab of thick oak held in place by a simple iron pin. But as I walked toward it, I saw something that made me freeze. On the surface of the trapdoor, there was a small, dark stain. It looked like oil, but it was too thick. I touched it. It was cold. It felt like dried blood, but the room had been scrubbed clean only that morning. I stared at the wood, and then I saw them, faint, deliberate scratches, just like the ones he had under his bed. They were numbers. A countdown. He hadn't just mapped the gallows, he had claimed them. He had been there, somehow, in the dark, in the hours between my rounds. He had been standing right where he would stand in 29 days. I looked up at the beam where the rope would hang, and for a second, just a heartbeat, I saw a shadow swaying there. Not a person, but the silhouette of a man who had already finished his journey and was waiting for me to catch up. I backed out of the room, my heart hitting my ribs so hard I could barely breathe. I ran back to the guard room and locked the door behind me. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't close my eyes. I sat there in the silence, listening to the prison grow quiet, terrified that when I looked at the floorboards, I would see those numbers appearing under my own feet, counting down the time until I had to face him in the dark again. The days started to blur. December arrived with a bitter, wet chill that clung to the prison walls like a shroud. I was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the gallows room, standing on that trapdoor, feeling the wood vibrate under my feet as if someone were walking on the underside of it. I stopped talking to the other guards. They noticed, of course. They started making jokes about me being spooked by a low-level felon. But they didn't know Elias. They didn't see the way he looked at them, with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. To them, he was a nuisance, a file to be processed. To me, he was a mirror. One night, the heavy iron key felt like lead in my hand as I approached his cell for the evening count. I didn't want to look. I wanted to just slide the tray under the door and move on. But he was leaning against the bars, his face partially obscured by the darkness of the cell. "You've been drinking again, Arthur," he said. His voice was calm, conversational. "You're trying to drown the noise, but you're just making it louder." I didn't stop. I kept walking, my pace forced and artificial. "Stay in your cell, Thorne," I snapped. He didn't move back. He pressed his face closer to the bars, and for the first time, I saw his eyes clearly in the dim corridor light. They were terrifyingly focused. "It's not the drinking that will get you," he continued, his tone shifting into something sharper, more dangerous. "It's the waiting. You think you're the one holding the rope. But have you ever considered that the rope is already holding you?" I reached the end of the corridor, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I locked myself in the guard station and stared at the logbook. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely write. I had to report him, I had to have him moved to the hole, but if I did, the warden would ask why. And how could I explain that a prisoner had gotten under my skin without admitting that I was already halfway to madness? I decided to take the long way back through the basement that night, avoiding the sea wing entirely. But the prison has a way of guiding you where you don't want to go. I found myself in the long, arched hallway that led directly beneath the gallows room. It was supposed to be restricted, but the lock on the heavy grate had been left slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The air in here was different, thick, metallic, and smelling of damp earth. I walked toward the center of the room, my flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the dust. The floor was uneven, scattered with debris from the old plumbing that had been ripped out decades ago. Then, I stopped. There, etched into the concrete directly beneath the center of the trapdoor, was a circle. It was fresh. The concrete was still scraped raw. Inside the circle were 12 hash marks. 12. One for every chapter of this hell he was dragging me through. I stood there, paralyzed, the flashlight trembling in my grip. I could hear the overhead trapdoor creaking. It was a rhythmic, slow sound, like the breathing of someone sleeping upstairs. But the room above was empty. I knew it was empty. I looked down at the hash marks, and then I saw something else. A piece of paper, folded into a tight square, was tucked into a crack in the concrete. I picked it up. My fingers felt like ice. I unfolded it, expecting a threat, a confession, something to explain the madness. It was a sketch. It was me. It wasn't a caricature. It was a precise, anatomical drawing of me, holding the lever. But in the drawing, my face was blank, no eyes, no mouth, just a hollow shell. Beneath it, in his precise, cramped handwriting, were the words, "The apprentice is almost ready." I didn't run this time. I couldn't. I just stood there in the dark, listening to the trapdoor above me give a sudden, sharp thud, as if someone had just stepped onto it. I realized then that Elias Thorne wasn't just waiting for his execution. He was teaching me how to perform mine. The cold had reached a point where the very air in the prison felt brittle, ready to shatter. I spent the next 3 days avoiding the basement, the gallows, and the sea wing, but Thorne's presence was like an infection. It was in the corners of my vision, it was in the way the other guards suddenly wouldn't meet my gaze, as if they could see the rot beginning to take hold of me. On the 4th night, I broke. I didn't head to the guard room, I went straight to Thorne's cell. I didn't carry a tray. I carried the keys, and a heavy, jagged piece of metal I'd pried from a loose floorboard in the workshop. I don't know what I intended to do. I think, in that moment, I just wanted to stop the noise in my head. I reached his door, and I didn't stop to look through the slit. I slid the key into the lock, the sound of the tumblers turning echoing like a gunshot in the dead of night. I pushed the door open. The cell was empty. My breath hitched, a jagged sound that tore at my throat. I swung my flashlight beam wildly around the small space. It was spotless. The cot was made with the kind of military precision that was impossible for a man in solitary confinement. The walls were bare. There were no drawings, no scratches, no diagrams. But the smell was there, that metallic, damp scent of the basement, of earth and iron. And then I saw it. On the pillow, perfectly centered, was a single, long strand of coarse hemp fiber. A piece of the rope. I heard a sound behind me, a soft, deliberate exhale. I spun around, the piece of metal raised, but the corridor was vacant. Nothing but the long, receding rows of shadows. Thorne wasn't there, and yet, he was everywhere. I could hear his voice, not as a whisper in my ear, but as a thought in my own mind, clear and cold. Asterisk, you're looking for a body, Arthur. You're looking for flesh and bone. You don't understand the nature of the cage, asterisk. I backed out of the cell, my pulse thrumming in my ears like a drum. I slammed the door shut and locked it, the metallic clack of the bolt sounding like a finality. I ran back toward the guard room, my boots skidding on the frost-covered floor, but the prison had changed. The hallways felt longer, the ceilings lower. The doors to the other cells were all open, a silent, gaping invitation. I reached the guard station and threw myself inside, slamming the lock home. I sat there, gasping, my hands pressed against my eyes. I was alone. I was absolutely alone. Then, the intercom crackled. It was a dying, broken sound, the kind of static that sounds like 1,000 voices screaming underwater. Arthur. I froze. The voice was mine. It sounded exactly like me, but hollowed out, stripped of all humanity. Asterisk Arthur, check the gallows room. I left you a gift, asterisk. I grabbed the radio handset, my knuckles white. Who is this? I screamed, the terror finally breaking through the wall of my professionalism. Who the hell is this? There was no answer, just the sound of a heavy, iron bolt sliding into place, the sound of the trapdoor being armed. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to smash the window, to jump from the wall and never look back. But I couldn't move. I was tied to this place. I was tied to Thorn. I walked to the door, my legs moving with the stiff, puppet-like grace of a man walking to his own grave. I walked through the darkness, the silence of the prison now heavy and suffocating, waiting for what I knew I would find. The gallows room door was standing wide open. And in the center of the trapdoor, illuminated by a single, flickering bulb, was a pair of my own shoes, tied together with a hangman's knot. The countdown had reached 8. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that I wasn't just the one who would pull the lever. I was the one who was meant to stand on the other side. The shock of seeing my own shoes on that trapdoor didn't make me scream. It made me numb. I stood in the doorway, the air so cold it felt like needles in my lungs. My shadow stretched out before me, long and distorted, reaching toward the center of the room. I felt like an intruder in my own life. I walked toward the trapdoor. My boots made no sound, as if the floorboards were trying to swallow my presence. I looked down at the knot. It was perfect, the 7 coils, the precise tension. It was the knot I had spent years perfecting, the one I had taught myself to tie in the dark. But I hadn't tied this. I reached down to touch the rope, and as my fingers grazed the coarse fiber, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my own breath, a pale, ragged mist. Arthur, a voice said. It didn't come from the hallway. It came from the pit beneath the trapdoor. I dropped to my knees. The wood was vibrating, a low-frequency hum that rattled my teeth. I peered through the gaps in the boards, expecting to see the basement floor. Instead, I saw my room. My bed, my small desk, the glass of whiskey I had left on the nightstand. And sitting on the edge of my bed, back turned to me, was Elias Thorne. He was holding my logbooks, the ones where I recorded every execution, turning the pages with movements slow and deliberate. "How are you doing that?" I whispered. He stopped turning the pages. He didn't turn around, but his voice echoed as if he were standing right behind me. "You think the prison is made of stone, Arthur. But you're wrong. The prison is memory. And you've spent your whole life building yours." He began to read from the logbook, reciting the names of the men I had sent through that door. Every name was a weight, a heavy, sinking stone in my gut. He didn't read them with malice, he read them like a final accounting of a life spent in the service of death. He leaned forward, his reflection in the pit becoming clearer. His face was a map of exhaustion, a mirror image of the man I saw when I looked in the mirror every morning. "You're tired of the lever, aren't you?" he asked. "You're tired of the weight of the rope. You want to stop. But you can't. Because you're not the executioner, Arthur. You're the witness." The reflection flickered. He turned his head, just an inch. He was smiling, a thin, sad, terrifying smile. "I'll see you tomorrow." The reflection vanished. The vibration stopped, and I was left alone. I returned to my quarters, but the walls felt thinner, membranes between my reality and the void Thorne inhabited. I sat on my bed, staring at the whiskey glass, now empty. My logbooks lay scattered across the desk, but the ink was fresh, glistening with a wet, midnight sheen. As I approached, I saw my own handwriting beginning to shift, the letters elongating, curling into shapes that looked like the anatomy of a dying star. I reached out to close the book, but my hand passed through the paper as if it were solidified smoke. Thorn wasn't just rewriting my history, he was erasing the distinction between the observer and the observed. I watched in frozen horror as my reflection in the mirror began to move independently, its fingers tracing lines across its own throat, mimicking the exact tension of that seven-coil knot. Every shadow in the room detached itself, pacing in time with my frantic heartbeat. The air grew thick with the smell of wet hemp and ozone. I realized that the trapdoor I had left behind was not a portal, but an anchor. It had tethered my soul to the mechanism I operated. The prison wasn't punishing the condemned, it was using me as a conduit, a funnel through which the weight of all those forgotten lives was being poured back into the world. Thorn was the architect, and I was merely the mortar holding the bricks in place. I collapsed onto the floor. For a fleeting moment, I could hear them, the voices of the men I had ended, millions of whispers rising like a tide. They weren't screaming. They were begging for the silence I had granted them. Thorn's laughter began to resonate within my chest, a suffocating pressure. I closed my eyes, but the darkness was no longer my own, it was filled with the jagged silhouette of the gallows, and I knew that when the sun rose, I wouldn't be the one walking to the lever. I would be the one waiting for the echo of my own boots to finally fall silent. I stood up, my knees shaking. I looked at the shoes, still tied together. I didn't untie them. I left them there. I walked out, and as I locked the door, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't just working the night shift. I was living inside the execution. And Elias Thorn hadn't just moved into my head, he had started to rewrite the script. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I spent the night in the guard station with the lights burning at full intensity, my eyes fixed on the heavy iron door as if it were the only barrier between my soul and total annihilation. Every time the shadows in the corridor shifted, twisting into elongated, agonizing shapes, my hand drifted toward the service pistol at my belt, though I knew the metal was useless against an entity that could rot a man's sanity through a mirror reflection. By the time the sun, a pale, sickly gray light, began to bleed through the high, barred windows, I felt like I was unraveling, my nerves vibrating like frayed wire. The other guards looked at me with a mix of pity and visceral suspicion. I was the ghost haunting my own station, a hollowed-out husk of a man. I had to get back to cell 402. I had to know if he was still there. When I reached the C-wing, the corridor was freezing, biting into my skin like microscopic teeth. It was an aggressive, predatory chill that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of my lungs. I walked toward his cell, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, sickening velocity that threatened to burst my arteries. I arrived at the door, but I didn't slide the tray, I didn't announce the count. I just looked through the viewing slit, my breath hitching as the dark maw of the cell stared back. The cell was occupied. Elias Thorn was sitting on his cot. He wasn't staring at the wall, he was looking directly at the slit, his eyes fixed on mine with a dark, gluttonous hunger. He had been waiting for the exact second my eye touched the glass. He stood up, his movements fluid, disjointed, and predatory, like a spider rearranging its limbs. He leaned his forehead against the iron, his breath fogging the glass, smelling of burnt hair and stagnant, abyssal water. "I'm still here, Arthur," he whispered, the sound vibrating through the steel and drilling directly into my skull. "I'm not going anywhere until the work is finished." "What work?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the suffocating pressure of his presence. "What do you want from me?" He pulled back, his face inches from the slit, his skin stretched too tightly over his cheekbones like parchment on a corpse. "I want you to see the reality of the lever. You think it's a machine, but it's a connection. A circuit of suffering. When you pull it, you aren't just dropping a trapdoor, you're snapping the neck of a cycle that has been screaming for your blood for a very long time." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a brass key. It was tarnished and heavy, stained with a dark, oily residue that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He held it up to the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. "This is the key to the basement furnace," he said, his voice dropping into a guttural, wet rattle. "The one where they incinerated the records of the men who weren't supposed to exist, the men you murder. If you want to know who you really are, Arthur, look for the archive. It's buried under the thick, suffocating ashes of the victims you've spent your career ignoring." He dropped the key. It landed on the floor with a heavy, metallic ring that didn't just echo, it shrieked, a sound so sharp it made my ears bleed. I looked at the floor, then back at him. When I shifted my gaze, he was gone. The cell was a vacant, nauseating void. I unlocked the door, my hand steady with a cold, terrifying resolve, and stepped inside. The room felt like the interior of a tomb, the very walls slick with a cold, viscous sweat. I knelt down, my chest heaving, and reached into the dark corner. My fingers touched the key, and the moment I felt the icy, soot-covered metal, a violent, bone-shaking tremor ripped through the prison. It was the sound of something massive, something primal and starving, finally tearing its way through the concrete foundation of reality. I stood up, the key clutched in my palm, and looked toward the basement stairs. The prison was beckoning me into its throat. The countdown was at 6. I walked out, leaving the door hanging open like a severed jaw, and began the descent into the suffocating dark, heading toward a furnace that was hungering to incinerate the last pathetic remnants of my sanity. The descent into the basement felt like walking into the throat of the prison. The air grew thicker, burdened with the heavy scent of soot and rusted iron. Every step down the concrete staircase sent vibrations through my boots, a low-frequency rumble that hummed against my teeth. The brass key in my hand felt alive, it was vibrating in rhythm with the building, as if searching for a north that didn't exist. I reached the bottom and found myself in a labyrinth of pipes. The shadows here weren't just the absence of light, they had a weight that clung to my skin. I navigated the maze, guided by the insistent pull of the key. It dragged my hand toward a wall of firebrick, tucked behind a massive, dormant steam boiler that looked like a sleeping iron beast. There it was. A small, arched iron door, sealed with a layer of grime and decades of neglect. I inserted the key. It turned with a heavy, satisfying thump that echoed through the foundations. I pulled, and the door groaned open, spilling a plume of dust that tasted like dry earth and forgotten names. I stepped inside. The space was cavernous, constructed of dark, scorched brick. In the center stood the furnace, an architectural anomaly, an altar of iron and soot. It hadn't been used for years, yet the air was strangely warm. I swept my flashlight beam across the walls, they were covered in shelves holding hundreds of leather-bound ledgers. I pulled one down, the weight of it pulling at my arms. I opened it to a random page. It wasn't a record of deaths. It was a record of choices. I started reading, and my stomach turned. These were the private observations of every man who had ever held the position of executioner before me. Each ledger detailed the same descent into madness. They spoke of the rope not as a tool, but as a parasite. They spoke of the voice, the entity that lived in the architecture of the gallows, inheriting their guilt, their terrors, and their fractured sanity. I found the ledger marked *1922*. The handwriting was shaky and erratic. It described the final act of that year's executioner, a man who had realized that his own life was just another link in the chain. He had tried to burn the secrets, to destroy the records of the men who were erased from history, the ones who had no family, no graves, no names. He hadn't succeeded. The furnace had refused to consume the truth. As I read, I realized why Elias Thorne had sent me here. He wasn't trying to save me. He was showing me the lineage. I was part of a cycle, a 12-part tragedy that had been playing out for a century. Every man who stood on that trapdoor was contributing to a singular, monstrous entity that fed on the finality of death. I looked up, my heart stuttering. A movement caught my eye in the far corner. A figure was standing there, obscured by shadow. It wasn't Elias. It was a silhouette that shifted and blurred like smoke. It had no face, only a presence, a cold, hollow vacancy that chilled the room to the point of frost. "You're late," the voice said. It wasn't Elias's voice, and it wasn't mine. It was a chorus of a dozen different voices, layered on top of each other, creating a sound that made my ears ache. I couldn't move. "What are you?" I rasped, my voice sounding pathetic in the vastness of the furnace room. The figure stepped forward. It was the uniform of an executioner from a different era. "I am the collection," the chorus replied. "I am the sum of every drop of life that passed through the trapdoor. You aren't the 44th, Arthur. You are simply the latest layer." I dropped the ledger. "I'm not part of this," I shouted, panic overriding the paralysis. "I'm leaving." "You can't leave a circle," the voice said, a flat, dead finality. "The trapdoor is already open. You're just waiting for the rope to tighten." I turned and ran. I scrambled up the stairs, my lungs burning, the key clutched in my hand. I burst out of the basement and back into the sea wing, gasping for air, expecting to hear the sounds of the prison night shift. But the wing was silent. No lights. No shouting. The prison had become a tomb. I walked to the window. There was nothing. Just an endless, featureless gray void. The prison had been unmoored from the world. We were drifting in a void, trapped in a reality designed by the man in cell 402. The countdown had reached 5. I was running deeper into the machine. The void outside the window was absolute. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, hoping to feel the vibration of the real world, the distant hum of a car on the highway, the rustle of wind in the trees, but there was nothing. Just a dead, suffocating stillness. The prison was no longer a building, it was an island floating in a sea of nothingness, and I was its last, terrified inhabitant. I turned away from the window, the brass key still burning in my palm. The silence of the sea wing was so absolute it was deafening. It had a physical weight, a pressure that squeezed the air out of my chest. I started walking, my footsteps sounding like cannon fire in the empty corridor. I had to reach the gallows room. I had to know if the trapdoor was still waiting. As I passed cell 402, I didn't look. I couldn't bear to see it empty again. But as I hurried by, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. A rhythmic, metallic scratching. It was the sound of a pen on paper, precise and rapid. Asterisk scratch. Scratch. Scratch, asterisk. I spun around. The cell door was closed, but the shadow beneath it was flickering, as if there were a lamp burning inside. I rushed to the viewing slit and peered in. Elias Thorne was sitting at a small wooden desk that hadn't been there before. He was hunched over, his back to me, writing feverishly in a thick, leather-bound ledger identical to the ones I had seen in the furnace room. He was covered in soot, the same black, gritty ash that had coated my fingertips in the basement. He didn't turn around, but he stopped writing the moment my eye touched the glass. "You went to the furnace, Arthur," he said, his voice no longer hollow, but rich, vibrant, and terrifyingly human. "You saw the collection. You saw the layers. You're not real," I hissed, my voice trembling. "None of this is real. This is a breakdown. A chemical imbalance." He finally turned. His face was a mirror of mine. Not just a resemblance, it was my face, aged by decades, etched with the same lines of stress and the same hollow look of a man who had seen the bottom of the well. He smiled, and I saw a gold tooth in his mouth that matched the one my father had, the one I had inherited and hated. "Real?" he chuckled, standing up. "Real is a concept for people who aren't on the schedule. You're on the schedule, Arthur. We're both on the schedule." He walked toward the door, and for a terrifying moment, the steel bars seemed to dissolve like mist. He stepped out into the corridor, not as a prisoner, but as an authority. He smelled of old rope and burned hair. He reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. His touch wasn't cold, it was searing hot, like a brand. "The furnace didn't just record the deaths, Arthur. It recorded the guilt. Every bit of hesitation, every regret, every soul that didn't quite leave the room when the trapdoor dropped, it all stayed here. The prison is a vacuum for the things that refuse to die." I tried to pull away, but my muscles were frozen. I was a puppet, and he was pulling the strings. "Why me?" I managed to choke out. "Because you were the only one who didn't look away," he said, leaning into my ear. "The others? They were weak. They tried to forget. They died of broken hearts or empty bottles. But you kept watching. You kept counting. You're the perfect vessel for the collection." He turned me around, guiding me toward the gallows room as if we were colleagues on a routine patrol. "4, Arthur. Only 4 steps left until the circuit is closed. You've been a good student, but the apprenticeship is over." I looked down at my hands. They were beginning to fade, turning translucent, the skin taking on the texture of old, yellowed parchment. I wasn't just losing my mind, I was losing my existence. I was being absorbed into the history of the room. "I won't do it," I said, though my voice sounded distant, like it was coming from the end of a long, narrow pipe. "I won't pull the lever." "You don't have to," Elias replied, his voice fading into the shadows of the ceiling. "The machine has a mind of its own. It's been waiting a century for a hand as steady as yours to guide it. You're not the one who pulls the lever, Arthur. You're the one who is the lever." He pushed me forward. I stumbled, my feet moving toward the gallows room with a will of their own. I reached the door, and it swung open, revealing the room bathed in a blinding, artificial light. The trapdoor was open, the pit beneath it swirling with the dark, suffocating fog of the void. And standing on the edge, looking down into the abyss, was a figure. It was me. I was standing there, wearing my uniform, my back to the door. I watched as my other self reached out a hand, fingers trembling, toward the iron lever. The countdown had reached 4. And I realized, with a scream that had no sound, that I was watching myself commit the final act of the lineage, over and over, in an infinite loop of death and duty. The version of me standing on the gallows was not a reflection, it was a memory that had curdled into reality. I watched myself reach for the lever, my fingers ghost white against the rusted iron. The room began to hum, a high-pitched, piercing vibration that made the very air feel like it was vibrating out of existence. I tried to scream, but the sound was stolen by the shadows. I was a spectator in my own betrayal. As my other self gripped the lever, the floorboards beneath me groaned. The wood didn't just creak, it wept. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep up through the grain of the oak, not blood, but something older, something thick like crude oil, smelling of the earth and the forgotten years of the furnace. It pooled around my feet, pulling me down, anchoring me to the history of the room. "Look at him," Elias whispered. He was standing right behind me now, his breath hot against the back of my neck. "Look at the man who thought he was just doing his job. He thinks if he keeps his eyes open, he can witness the truth. He doesn't realize that by watching, he's participating." My other self pulled the lever. The sound wasn't a crack or a snap. It was a roar, the collective gasp of 100 men who had fallen through that same trapdoor. The floor dropped away, and for a heartbeat, I saw into the abyss. It wasn't empty. It was filled with faces, a swirling, turbulent mass of eyes, mouths, and hands, all reaching upward, all seeking a surface to cling to. They weren't ghosts, they were the static of the universe, the discarded energy of souls that had been denied their rest. My other self vanished into that mass of faces. He didn't scream. He simply dissolved, his features melting away like wax in a furnace, his uniform shredding into ribbons of shadow. He was gone, erased from the timeline, swallowed by the machine. The trapdoor slammed back into place with a sound that shook the building to its foundations. I fell forward, collapsing onto the trapdoor. The wood was burning hot, vibrating with the residual energy of the man who had just ceased to exist. I was alone in the room, the blinding light fading into a sickly, pulsing amber. The countdown on the wall, the 12 hash marks I had seen in the basement, erased themselves one by one, leaving only 3. 3. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving, the air thick with the smell of scorched ozone. I looked at my hands. They were solid again, but they were covered in a fine, gray soot. I tried to wipe it off, but it smeared into my skin, turning my pores black. I was becoming part of the infrastructure. I was becoming the wall, the lever, the floor. I turned to run, but the door was gone. The wall was smooth, seamless stone, as if it had been sealed for centuries. I pounded on it, my knuckles bleeding, but the sound was muffled, as if I were underwater. "The cycle is accelerating, Arthur," Elias's voice echoed, coming from everywhere and nowhere. It was no longer a human voice, it was the grinding of gears, the shifting of heavy stone, the dry rustle of rope. "You've seen the fall. You've seen the erasure. Now, you have to understand the transition." I spun around, looking for any exit, any crack in the armor of the room. The room began to change. The walls softened, stretching and folding like wet clay. The furniture of the prison cell, the cot, the desk, the tray, began to materialize in the center of the gallows room, forming a bizarre, nightmare furniturescape. I looked up at the ceiling. The heavy timber beams were beginning to splinter, and hanging from them weren't just ropes, but veins, pulsing, dark conduits that connected the floor to the roof, feeding the trapdoor, feeding the void. "I won't accept this," I shouted, my voice now layered with the same chorus of voices I had heard in the basement. I was already starting to change. "I am not a layer. I am a man." "A man is just a temporary state of matter," the room replied. The stone walls began to bleed light, a cold, ultraviolet glow that illuminated the hidden geometry of the prison. I saw the blueprint of the gallows room burned into the air. It was a trap, not just for the condemned, but for the entire concept of morality. It was a machine designed to extract the human essence and leave behind only the duty, the cold, administrative indifference of the state. I collapsed in the center of the floor, the soot spreading up my arms, consuming the identity of Arthur Phillips. I was the 44th, but I was also the first, and the last, and the infinite. I was the executioner of 100 years of shadows. The countdown hit 2. The silence was absolute. I lay there, waiting for the final gear to click into place, knowing that when it did, there would be nothing left of me to witness the end. The room was shrinking. The stone walls, once immovable and cold, were now pulsing like the interior of a lung. With every breath the building took, the space around me grew tighter, forcing me toward the center of the trapdoor. The soot on my skin had hardened into a crust, a second layer of armor that felt heavier than lead. I was no longer an observer. I was the core of the machine. "Listen," Elias whispered. He was closer now, not behind me, but inside me. His voice resonated in the hollow spaces of my chest, vibrating against my ribs. "Listen to the radio." I hadn't realized I was holding it, but there, clutched in my blackened, soot-stained fingers, was the analog radio I had used to record these confessions. It was no longer emitting static. It was broadcasting a low, steady hum, a frequency that matched the beating of my own heart. I raised it to my ear. Through the hum, I heard voices. Not screaming, not pleading, just talking. 100 different conversations, layered over each other like a storm of whispers. They were the voices of every man I had ever sent through the door. They weren't dead, they were trapped in the transmission, held in the amber of the radio circuitry, forever waiting for someone to tune in. "They're not gone, Arthur," Elias said, his voice now a perfect mimicry of my own. "They're just reorganized. They're part of the broadcast now. And soon, you will be the signal." I tried to drop the radio, but my fingers were fused to the plastic casing. My skin had begun to weave itself into the wiring. I could feel the electricity coursing through my nerves, a cold, jagged current that replaced my blood. I wasn't just losing my humanity, I was being digitized, compressed, and uploaded into the history of the prison. The room erupted in a sudden, violent strobe of light. Every surface, the walls, the floor, the beams, was suddenly covered in writing. It was the logs. Thousands of names, dates, and times, spiraling in a chaotic, hypnotic pattern that made my vision blur. I saw my own name, Arthur Phillips, written in bold, crimson ink. Next to it, the date was not 1944. It was today. "Two," I croaked. The word tasted like copper and ash. "No," the chorus of voices replied. "It's already 1." The floor beneath me began to tilt. The trapdoor, the iron lever, the heavy oak beams, they all started to liquefy, melting into a single, cohesive mass of machinery. The prison was transforming into a clockwork horror, a colossal, grinding apparatus designed for a single purpose, the conversion of consciousness into pure, immutable records. I looked at the radio in my hand. The dial was spinning on its own, clicking through channels, catching fragments of my own voice from the previous chapters. Asterisk, I am the executioner. You're the apprentice. I'll see you tomorrow, asterisk. It was a loop. A feedback loop of my own suffering. I was broadcasting my own disintegration to an audience of ghosts. Is this the end? I screamed, my voice tearing through the thin fabric of the room. Is there no exit? No mercy? Mercy is a human concept, Arthur, Elias replied, and this time, he stood directly in front of me. He was no longer me, and he was no longer Elias. He was a construct of light and static, a flicker of pure information. The machine doesn't know mercy. It only knows the weight. It knows the tension. It knows the drop. He reached out and placed his hand over the radio speaker. The screaming stopped. The static vanished. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt like the absence of the universe. "You've done well," he said, his presence now feeling like a weight upon the world. "You've documented the architecture of the void. You've mapped the circuit. And now, you have to provide the final surge." He gestured to the lever, which was now protruding from my own shoulder, a piece of rusted iron fused to my collarbone. "The countdown is at 1, Arthur. The circuit is waiting. There is no more executioner. There is only the act." I looked at my own body. I was a mosaic of wire, wood, and bone. I was the gallows. I was the cage. I was the witness and the victim, the lever and the drop. I realized then that the radio hadn't been a way to escape, it had been the conduit through which I had been pouring my soul into the machine for the last 10 chapters. I had built my own prison, brick by brick, word by word. The light in the room flared into a blinding, white-hot intensity. I felt the lever on my shoulder begin to pull, triggered by a mechanism I couldn't control. My muscles spasmed, my arm jerking upward with the force of a hydraulic piston. The trapdoor groaned, the iron pin sliding free. The abyss opened. And as I started to fall, I realized that I wasn't falling down. I was falling into the broadcast. I was becoming the signal. And somewhere, in the dark, cold basement of the world, someone was just about to turn on a radio and hear me screaming. I didn't hit the floor. I didn't hit the bottom of the pit. I didn't hit anything. I was drifting through a space that had no dimensions, a static-filled expanse that felt like the interior of a shattered mirror. Every direction I looked, I saw glimpses of the prison, but they were disjointed, like photographs dropped in a hurricane. I saw the warden's office, frozen in 1944. I saw the sea wing, decaying into dust. I saw the furnace, roaring with a flame made of pure, white noise. I wasn't Arthur Phillips anymore. I was a sequence of data, a ghost in the machine, a ripple in the fabric of 100 years of recorded misery. Where am I? I tried to ask, but my voice wasn't a sound. It was a line of text, a flickering prompt appearing on the internal HUD of this nightmare. "You are in the archive," a voice responded. It didn't come from Elias. It came from the building itself. The prison had a voice, and it sounded like the grinding of a million hinges. Asterisk, you are the 11th layer. You are the index, asterisk. I floated toward a cluster of light that looked like a burning star. As I got closer, I realized it was a room, the warden's private study. Behind a massive, mahogany desk sat a man. He looked like the warden, but his face was a shifting mosaic of every guard, administrator, and bureaucrat who had ever signed a death warrant. He was looking at a ledger. My ledger. The one I had been filling for the last 10 chapters. "The work is nearly complete, 44, the warden said, not looking up. His voice was the sound of dry paper turning. "The series is almost archived. Every fear you felt, every nightmare you birthed, every moment of doubt you recorded, it's all being converted into history. You've given us exactly what we needed, the perspective of the man who holds the rope. I was a human being. I projected, the frustration tearing through the static. I had a name. Names are just variables, the warden replied, finally looking up. His eyes were not eyes, they were camera lenses, cold and unblinking. You came here to find meaning in the violence. You came here to understand why the world allows a man to hang another. And now you know. It isn't for justice, it's for the archive. The machine requires the documentation of pain to keep the gears turning. Without the witness, the act is meaningless. You provided the narrative. I looked around the room. Shelves were packed with thousands of ledgers. Each one represented a different executioner, a different decade, a different story of descent. Is this the warden's secret? I asked, the static in my mind swirling. That the prison isn't a place for the condemned, but a factory for the executioners. The condemned are just fuel, the warden said, standing up. They are the heat that turns the turbine. But the executioners? You are the storage. You are the memory of the state. We keep you here, in the archive, so the cycle never forgets how to kill. We don't need the rope anymore, Arthur. We have the story. As long as someone is reading it, as long as someone is listening, the trapdoor will never close. I realized then why Elias had sent me here. He wasn't the prisoner. He was the librarian. He was the one responsible for collecting the stories, for ensuring that every executioner was broken, digitized, and filed away on these shelves. I won't let you file me, I screamed, surging toward the desk. I wanted to tear the pages, to scatter the archive into the void. But as I reached for the desk, my hands passed through it like smoke. I had no form. I was nothing but a recording. You've already filed yourself, the warden said, a pitying smile on his face. Chapter 11 is written. All that remains is the final entry. He pointed to a door at the back. It was a broadcast studio. I could see a microphone, a set of headphones, and an old, analog radio. Go on, Arthur, he whispered. The world is waiting for the end of the broadcast. Give them the finale they paid for. Give them the silence they crave. I walked toward the studio, my movements dictated by the architecture. I sat at the console. The red, on-air light flickered to life, casting a blood-red glow over the desk. I put on the headphones. I could hear them. Millions of listeners, all over the world, lying in the dark, tuning into this frequency, waiting for the last chapter of a story that would never end. I reached for the microphone. I was ready. I was the archive. I was the 12th chapter. And I knew that the moment I finished speaking, I would be filed away on the shelf, right next to the executioner of 1922. The countdown was at 1. The room went black. And I began to speak. The red, on-air light pulsed like a dying heart. It was the only thing visible in the infinite, suffocating blackness of the archive. I sat before the microphone, the headphones pressing against my ears with the weight of a century of recorded screams. I didn't need to write anything down. The history of Stateville, the lineage of the 44 executioners, the secrets of the furnace, it was all written into my marrow. I reached out and flicked the switch. The static returned, but it wasn't noise anymore. It was a symphony of every man I had ever sent into the pit. This is the final broadcast, I said. My voice was calm, devoid of the panic that had defined the last 11 chapters. It sounded like stone grinding against stone. This is Arthur Phillips, the last of the line. If you're listening, you've traveled the distance. You've walked the hall. You've looked into the furnace. And now, You're standing with me on the edge of the trapdoor. I could feel the machine humming beneath the console, a rhythmic, deep-seated vibration that syncs with the rotation of the earth. I looked at the radio on the desk. It wasn't just a recording device, it was the mechanism of the world. Every story, every crime, every death, it was all being broadcast into the collective consciousness, a loop that kept the fear alive, kept the gears greased with our attention. You wanted to know what happens in the basement, I continued. You wanted to know the weight of the soul when it leaves the body. But that's the trick. The soul doesn't leave. It stays. It stays in the wood of the floor, in the rust of the lever, in the static of the air. We are the architects of our own hell, and we've spent 100 years building this prison, brick by bloody brick. I stood up. The room began to tear apart. The walls dissolved into millions of tiny, flickering letters, the words of my own story, floating in the void like snow. The warden's desk, the ledgers, the archives, they were all melting, feeding into the microphone. Elias Thorne wasn't a prisoner, I said, my voice rising, echoing across the void. He was the catalyst. He was the one who broke the mirror so we could see that we were all trapped in the reflection. And now, the reflection is ending. I walked toward the center of the room. The trapdoor was there, hanging in the middle of nothingness. I didn't reach for the lever this time. I walked to the edge and looked down. The abyss wasn't dark. It was glowing with the light of 1,000,000 radio waves, the sum total of human misery, transmitted through time. I turned back to the microphone one last time. If you want to end the cycle, I said, don't listen to the story. Stop feeding the machine. The archive is full. The shelves are collapsing. But as long as you keep turning the dial, as long as you keep looking for the truth in the static, the trapdoor will stay open. It's not about the executioner. It's about the audience. It's about you. I reached out and grabbed the lever. It wasn't iron. It felt like my own spine, a rigid column of bone and history. I pulled it. There was no sound of a door dropping. There was only the sound of a radio being unplugged, a sudden, sharp, final silence. The void collapsed. The light of the on-air sign shattered into 1,000,000,000 sparks, turning the world white. I felt myself falling, but for the first time, there was no fear. I was falling out of the recording. I was falling out of the archive. I was falling back into the quiet, dark, beautiful nothingness where no one was watching, and no one was keeping score. The sensation of the rope, the smell of the damp earth, the rhythm of the grandfather clock, it all faded away, replaced by the sound of real rain. Not the rain from a recording, not the rain from a story, but the soft, cold, indifferent rain of a world that didn't know I existed. I closed my eyes. The countdown hit 0. And then, there was nothing. No prison. No gallows. No Arthur Phillips. Just the silence. And for the first time in 100 years, it was enough. The recording ends abruptly with the sound of a dead channel, a long, flat, empty hum that slowly fades into the sound of someone turning a radio knob to the off position.